This is depressing. So chapter 1, we talked about it was more of this Gentile feel, how the Gentiles had demonstrated their sin and their fault. And then we went to chapter 2, and we talked about how the Jews hadn't really done a whole lot better. And so far, in chapter 3, where we've been, Paul has just come straight out and said, hey, nobody's righteous. Everybody does wrong. I mean, we are all condemned on account of our sin. We are all, each and every one of us, doomed to an eternity separated from our Creator. Well, just hearing from some of you guys in the prayer requests, I feel like a lot of you guys have kind of had a day like mine, had a rough day. There was some stress, irritation, frustration, anger, just all manner of just really undesirable things that have just really been hitting me from all sides ever since I rolled out of bed this morning. A number of things that want to make me roll back into bed. But if you're like me, you could really use some good news. Well, let me assure you guys, if you need some good news, you've come to the right place. Can I get someone to read verses 21 through 26?
Can I?
You certainly may. Oh, we have our priest in the building. It's nice to know. Thank you, sir.
But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear to witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over the former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus.
Thank you. And Kessa pointed it out. There was one of our conjunctions right there. And that's actually the first note that I have in my outline. So, Doc, in your tally counter, this particular one, this is but right here, this very first word in verse 21, I want you to underline it, I want you to highlight it, bold it, italicize, whatever else fancy you can do to it, because this is what changes everything. Right here, this changes the entire scope of everything that we have read up through this point in Romans. Everything that we have read and studied up to this point has led up to the absolute game change that occurred when God himself was hoisted upon two rough wooden beams as a sacrifice for all mankind. But it's 3 letters, 1 syllable. It's such a small, simple word. Bless you, whoever sneezed. But after this, nothing can stay the same. If you talk to me for any length of time, I will eventually probably mention my 2 favorite words in all the Bible. In the English language. In Greek, they're different. But in English, my 2 favorite words in the Bible are but God. 6 letters, 2 syllables. But nowhere else in all of existence will you see such a dramatic change as when those 2 words show up together. And in Romans 3:21, I understand they don't appear right beside each other, but they appear in the same verse, and the emphasis is there. But God. This verse is no exception. Matter of fact, there may not be a place where the words but God have wrought a more powerful transformation than in this verse right here. Now, I'm going to ask you guys to jog your memory just a bit. Do you remember what I told you, that what the key thing to take out of our study from verses 1 through 9 in chapter 3? Do you remember what I told you to remember from that? You guys didn't think there was going to be an exam. I did mention that there was going to be a little bit more about verse 8, but we haven't come to that yet. The thing that I mentioned was that God's righteousness cannot be affected by man's deeds. It is completely independent of anything that man can do. God's righteousness exists beyond the reach of man to influence. You guys remember that? Okay, good. That means I did say it and I'm not just making stuff up. That's good. This one fact is so key to understanding the power and the possibility of the gospel. So here we go. We see that God's unchangeable righteousness has been made manifest, and you guys know what manifest means, right? Fun word. Yeah, you're right, Kessa. It essentially means shown, made visible, or made clear, evident is kind of the idea. It's been made clear through the person of Jesus Christ. But look at this next little phrase. This is amazing. This next little statement here, apart from the law. Because if we back up a verse, just back to verse 20, we see that no one can be justified by the law. It literally says that, verse 20, by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in the sight of God. So now we have this interesting thing where we have the law, which up to this point has been the factor in determining the righteousness of man, by that no man has been righteous. And now we have the righteousness of God being made visible apart from the law. But this next part is just as important, that the law and the prophets bear witness to this righteousness. And just as the Bible is the greatest commentary on itself, you guys can mark that one on your bingo card. This lines up perfectly with what Jesus himself said. If you go back to, there are a number of verses all throughout Scripture that line up with this, but I picked one out. I really like Matthew 5:17. It says, "Don't think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." This is Jesus speaking. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." This is the idea that Jesus is speaking about here in Matthew 5, where he says that I have come to fulfill everything. The law and the prophets, what they were building up to was me. This is just a great example of how Jesus is the ultimate culmination of everything written in the Old Testament. The entire Old Testament, all 39 books, were building up to Jesus. But then we have another question. If the righteousness of God, made visible through the person of Jesus, is independent of the law, apart from the law, how is it that the law foretold it? Well, the idea of being apart here is more of an idea of independence. It means that this righteousness came without the need adherence to the law. And that's good news. Because, again, verse 20 tells us that according to the law, no man's going to be justified. So, yay! Some good news. That's good. Yay! And boy, when you hit verse 22, this just takes off. Because, as we covered, the holiness of God, we talked about this before, the holiness of God demands our holiness. And the law was intended to be our source of righteousness, but all it does is it demonstrates our severe shortcomings in that regard. But while verse 21 talks about the manifestation of God's righteousness, verse 22 takes it one very important step further. It doesn't talk about its visibility, but it now talks about its availability. You see it? Right there, verse 22. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. How amazing is that statement? Think about it. Did you guys catch the speed of that? Just think about what Paul already wrote. He spent 2.5 chapters writing about our sin and our shortcomings and how we are completely screwed. I mean, he said, look, the Gentiles, they're sinners, so no righteousness. Jews, well, the Jews were failures in their holy duty, so no righteousness there. And look, I'll even say it outright. No one is righteous according to the law. But this righteousness we started talking about here, it's for everyone and anyone who believes. I'll admit, when I was writing this, I was tempted to just stop right there and just decide to talk about that for the rest of the study. Do you guys understand the magnitude of that? We are sinners. We are an affront to the nature and the character of God. Do you remember how Ungerth last week in the Bible study? Ungerth, do you remember what you said and how I wanted to comment on it?
I said in rebellion, right?
Yes, you said that we were traitors. You said we were guilty of treachery against the Most High God. We deserve condemnation by all counts. And then we hit verse 21 and we get those two words, but God, as Ungerth put it, sought to redeem our act of treachery. This is why we call it the gift of God. We didn't have any right to it. Matter of fact, we deserve the exact opposite. We deserve no mercy. We had no merit that God should grant us a path of righteousness. But his righteousness is independent from anything that we do. That's why God doesn't call us to work for our salvation, because it's only because we place our faith in his merit that we obtain his righteousness. And that's important, Shada. This blew me away. When I saw this for the first time, I literally I could feel like it was like Brian Regan in my brain trying to blow out the back of my head. It was amazing. You guys remember back in verse 10 of chapter 3? It's part of the Romans road. We have a bunch of verses that kind of outline the Romans road. Romans 3:10 is one of them. None is righteous, no, not one. That sounds real uplifting. Thanks, Paul. Well, in verse 23, Romans 3:23, it's another part of the Romans road. It might be the most famous verse in all of Romans. We get what seems to be an exact copy of verse 10, Romans 3:10, none is righteous, no, not one. And Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. It's the same idea. There's really no distinction. But, for years, I had never understood why the Romans road had both of those verses. And yes, Josh has nailed it. If I had just I was just showing my own narrow-mindedness with that idea. Because if I had just paused and taken a step back and looked at the context, I would have made an amazing discovery. That the individual verses say the same thing, but they're going in completely different directions. In verse 10, Paul is affirming the total insufficiency of man to achieve righteousness on our own.
joined your channel.
You could call it total depravity. But when you come to verse 23, it's a setup for what we all too often miss, these tragically overlooked verses of 24 and 25. So we have Romans 3:23. It says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And then if you keep going, you see something amazing. And are justified. Look, and note, at the beginning of verse 24, it's not the word but. It's not a contrary statement. It's not posing an opposite idea, but it's a supporting idea that builds upon what was already said. It's the word and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a
TK3SOJ in your channel timed out.
by his blood to be received by faith. And then verse 25 just explodes. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he has passed over former sins. How? What? How do you follow that? I mean, what do you say in response? You're redeeming traitors and granting them the righteousness, the very holiness of the Son of God. What? Does that not leave you breathless? There's an old song that I can't help but feel when I read this. I'm sure you guys know it or have at least heard of it. It's called Amazing Grace. It's one of my favorite hymns, but when I read Romans 3:21-26, I can't help but wonder if John Newton didn't massively understate the grace of God. As much as I love the song, I'm like, I don't think you went far enough. I think you needed like a few hundred more verses. I mean, to be fair, it's not like he couldn't help it. Given the opportunity, I would probably keep us here for weeks trying to break all of this down. It's just, it is so deep. There is so much here. And this is just the climax. This is just a very, it's a powerful summary, but it is a summary of the nature of God in his gift to mankind through his grace. If we're going to do as I say and make the Bible the greatest commentary for itself, we're going to be here for a long, long time. Now, when a lot of you guys know, when I was in college, I was on a singing team, and they were called the Gospel Heralds. And
Donut,
when
3 chicken dinners,
on the team,
left your channel.
Calvary is the sea. And if you leave here with nothing else, guys, I honestly to God pray that you begin to understand the cataclysmic enormity of God's grace. And when I say cataclysmic, I mean that very intentionally. Because when you realize just the nature and the power and what God's grace truly means, it will literally change the landscape of your world forever. And then verse 26, good gracious. This is where what I told you guys back in the beginning of chapter 3, this idea that man can't touch God's righteousness. This is where the idea of God's immutable or unchangeable righteousness really comes into play. Remember, verse 20, the law can't save mankind. Okay? It can only condemn. And God's holiness and God's justice demanded that there had to be a payment. We'll read about this more when we come to chapter 6 in Romans. But there had to be a payment for sin. Our deeds had earned wages, Romans 6:23. And so there had to be a payment. There was a cost to our sin. This was our fate until verse 21, and we got that big old but God. God himself stepped into our place, our fate upon himself, and spared us from his own wrath. This showed God's just nature, as it says in verse 26. He might be just. This is the just nature of God, in that there had to be a payment. And as the demand for recompense, this demand for a payment was met. But at the same time, the sacrifice of Jesus on our behalf superseded the law. And it provided a new source of righteousness. It didn't depend on mankind anymore. We were given an opportunity to claim the righteousness thanks to the person of Jesus. But remember, we can't be saved by the law. Since the law didn't have any redeeming power for mankind, we needed another way. We needed another avenue to obtain this righteousness. And that's where we get the triumph of faith. With mankind now able to be saved, God wasn't merely just in his doings. He wasn't merely, train of thought just went. He wasn't right in what he did, so he wasn't only just. He became the justifier, and that's awesome because God didn't maintain his own rightness, but he granted rightness to those that didn't have it in the first place. And that's the key, guys. Why does faith work? Why does faith work? Do you know why faith works? Exactly, Shada. It's not about us at all. Faith is an expression of total dependence on another for their merit and value. Without faith, all we have is ourselves, and all we are failures in our attempts to keep the law, and that leaves us without any eternal hope. But when we surrender to God, then we place our trust in his power and his work to be our salvation. And since God already offered up himself as the perfect sacrifice, we can trust him fully as our salvation. And that brings up an interesting side point. And that would be the word surrender. It's not really a comfortable word. It's not a word we like to use a lot, is it? I mean, especially for me as a guy, because I'm like manly victory and you guys are ever around me when my sports team loses, I don't take that well. You ask any guy, you ask Globey about any Chicago team or football about the Saints or any guys that root for a particular sports team, we don't take defeat well. Because testosterone and must be the best. We must prove our dominance over all others. And so surrender gives this idea of defeat, and that bruises our pride, and we don't like that. That bothers us. But when you stop and really think about it, there should be no greater joy for the Christian than to surrender to Jesus Christ. Because if his sacrifice truly was the perfect sacrifice, and his resurrection truly overcame both sin and death, then our surrender to him means that we are surrendering to the ultimate victor. But remember, Jesus isn't just the victor, he's also our justifier. And he doesn't merely forgive us, but he invites us into his family, into his kingdom, onto his side. So in essence, surrendering to Jesus has nothing at all to do with defeat. Surrendering to Jesus is the act of embracing your ultimate victory. So what? I know that I said I'd go all the way through verse 31, but guys, tonight I just can't. I just can't. Two reasons primarily. For starters, I actually ran out of time in preparation. I didn't have enough time to make notes on the final 5 verses, so I apologize for that one. Or 4 verses, I guess. But you know what? I think God used that. Because tonight, I really think God wanted us to focus on him. Verses 21 through 26 are the decisive response to the dreary gloom of the first 2.5 chapters of the book of Romans. You know, because, you got bad news, 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 but God! And it's like Paul says, who cares about the bad news? My God did something about it. And I got news for you, buddy. When my God moves, there ain't nothing that's going to stop him. I mean, have you guys taken a look around recently? I mean, just turn on the news or don't, or just, get on the internet or listen to someone talk. You heard or seen anything about bad news? No need to answer that. Well played, Shada. We all have. I mean, just think about some of the stuff we've heard about in the last couple weeks. We've had hurricanes and earthquakes and floods and fires and shootings and violence, and there is just no shortage of bad news. It's easy to feel like you're starting to drown in all the bad news. Josh. One of my pastors preached a sermon a few weeks back on the last part of Philippians 3. And he was talking about how Christians, aren't from around here. It talks about our citizenship being in heaven. So the idea was, I'm not really from around here. My home is somewhere else. And at one point, he addressed the idea of how our citizenship in heaven alters our perspective here. I mean, we're surrounded by earthly problems, and kind of like Peter when he was walking on the Sea of Galilee, it's easy to focus on the problems around us. And this is what my pastor said. I'll never forget this. He said, we often ask God, Lord, have you seen my problems? God, have you seen what I'm dealing with here? But when we understand the nature of our heavenly citizenship and the Lord of that citizenship, then we can look at our problems and honestly ask, dude, have you seen my God? This is the unmatched power of the gospel. It is, just like it says back in Romans 1, 16 and 17, this is the power of God to look down on an impossible situation and be undaunted. God isn't afraid of the impossible. In fact, you know what? God is the God of the impossible. Only an omnipotent, holy, and loving God could look down on a rebellious and treacherous people and determine to not only be just, but to be their justifier, to be our justifier. So, welcome to the good news. Now, let it change your world. Your thoughts, guys. Josh, I see your light.
Yeah, I was waiting for the best time to say this, and you said it, where it was like looking down on the impossible, and deciding to do it. Just the whole notion of like converting to a religion and not taking 3 years to do it was like considered impossible at the time, especially to Jews. I think even to become like a pagan, it was a very extensive process. If you came over from another land and wanted to convert, but this is super straightforward. It's impossible for, I would say it's probably about impossible for them to even comprehend that, like, oh, I don't have to like take a test on the law for converting to this religion, which is pretty crazy.
And again, that's part of the entire the radical nature of I say Christianity, but I don't like using the term here. It's the radical idea of God, because ultimately what everything boils down to is it's not about us. It doesn't depend on us knowing or adhering to all this stuff. Our merit is completely on God. It's independent from anything that we do. His righteousness is like Jesus' righteousness has been imparted to us regardless of what we do. But at the same time, we covered this back in Jude, and we're going to cover it again here. We covered it a little bit. We're gonna hit it again in a few chapters. That God declares us righteous, and then we act from that. So, did you have more to add, Josh, or should I let Shada go first since her light was orange after yours?
Sorry, I forgot to turn my orange off.
Oh, okay. Shada.
Just a personal observation as kind of looking over kind of argument lines and stuff and how Paul's building this up. At first it seems like the but God phrase kind of like shoves all the 3 previous chapters to the side, but it almost at the same time though it seems to like it's part of the whole argument. It still builds on top of what he had just said about the law and everything, because it's not just saying, well, I built this argument for 3